Strasbourg, 1518. A thick mist clings to the cathedral spires, muffling the morning bells. Frau Troffea steps onto the cold stone pavement and stops. She lifts her right foot, then her left, in a precise, rhythmic cadence. Her arms sway, locked in a repetitive arc. She makes no sound. She does not speak. She only moves. Tap, tap, tap. The echo rings against the alley walls, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. By midday, she is still moving. Her husband rushes from their threshold, his hands gripping her shoulders to force her home. She twists away with a sudden, violent torque, her face drenched in sweat, her legs driving her into another turn. He stumbles back, his grip releasing, terror widening his eyes as he realizes she cannot stop. By the third day, the rhythmic friction has worn through the soles of her footwear. With every lift of her foot, a crimson stain blooms on the gray cobblestones. She has not eaten, she has not slept. She simply continues, her body a prisoner to a silent, relentless drive. While the city watches from behind locked shutters, the contagion did not wait for an invitation. A woman in the market reached for a basket of grain, stopped, and began to mirror the erratic, rhythmic swaying of the first dancer. A blacksmith dropped his hammer, his limbs seizing into the same relentless cadence. Within a week, 30 people were caught in the trance. They occupied the square, their movements sinking into a dissonant, collective pulse. Panic gripped the city council. They retreated to a candlelit chamber, the air thick with the smell of tallow and fear. They summoned physicians, demanding a reason for the breakdown of the streets. The doctors inspected the sweating, spinning figures, and reached a grim conclusion. They declared the movement a fever of the blood that required further exertion to purge. The council acted immediately. They ordered wooden stages built in the center of the square to accommodate the growing throng. They sent men into the streets to hire violinists and drummers, instructing them to play with relentless intensity. They believed that if the dancers were given a rhythm to follow, they would eventually exhaust themselves into stillness. They were wrong. As the first bow hit the strings, the square transformed into a hive of involuntary motion. The first note of the violin cut through the heavy air like a razor. Then came the drums, a low, percussive thud that vibrated through the cobblestones. The effect was immediate. 100 people, previously swaying in isolation, surged toward the center of the square. They climbed onto the wooden platforms, their limbs jerking in time with the frantic tempo. The wood groaned under the shifting weight, then splintered with a sharp crack, dumping a dozen dancers into the mud. They did not stop. They scrambled to their feet and continued the motion. More people joined, drawn into the pull of the sound. The crowd swelled, a tide of bodies pushing against the square's perimeter. 200, 300. The music grew louder, faster, demanding more from bodies already pushed to their limits. Faces turned upward, eyes glazed and unseeing, fixed on some invisible point in the sky. The square became a churning sea of flesh, a single, rhythmic entity of 400 souls. There was no room to breathe, no space to fall, only the constant, jarring drive of the beat. They were no longer individuals. They were a machine of bone and muscle, grinding against the stone, locked in a trance that defied the laws of fatigue. The music did not stop, but the dancers did. A man near the fountain stiffened, his eyes rolling back before he hit the stones with a hollow thud. His heart simply quit. No one broke stride. They stepped over him, their feet landing in the growing smear of red on the path. 15 times a day, the rhythm claimed a life. Carts rattled into the square, their wooden wheels grinding against the debris. Men with pitchforks hauled away the fallen, tossing them onto the stack like harvested wheat. The survivors did not look at the carts. They did not blink at the sight of the dead. They kept turning. Their lower limbs were raw, skin stripped away, leaving only the wet, dark movement of muscle against the jagged stone. Every pivot left a fresh streak on the cobblestones. The city watched from behind barricaded doors, silent and horrified. The dancers moved with the heavy, mechanical persistence of a clockwork mechanism that refused to wind down. They were no longer human in their intent. They were vessels for a singular, lethal motion. The square had become a graveyard that refused to stay still, where the living and the dead were bound by the same relentless, pulsing beat. After a month, the movement finally slowed. The survivors were herded through the streets toward the shrine of St. Vitus. Their feet left a trail of dark, dry crust on the ground. The heavy doors of the shrine groaned shut, sealing them inside. Then, the silence arrived. It was absolute. It pressed against the walls, heavier than the music had ever been. One by one, the dancers folded. Knees hit the floor, bodies slumped against the cold stone. The motion that had consumed them for weeks simply vanished. They fell into a deep, hollow exhaustion, motionless at last. 5 centuries have passed, yet the archives remain. Scholars still argue over the cause. Was it ergot poisoning from tainted rye, or a mass hysteria ignited by trauma? The records of the dead offer no verdict. In the quiet corners of Strasbourg, the mystery persists. It stands as a cold reminder of how easily the human mind can fracture, and how thin the line is between reality and the abyss. The dance ended, but the question remains, haunting the history of the city like a ghost that refuses to fade.